They actually held a family meeting to help me find a job, sat me down like I was some sort of charity case, like I was lost and needed to be rescued from my own life. They even had a name for it. Career Planning for Linda. I remember because they wrote it in Sharpie on the top of a yellow legal pad. I remember because I sat there and stared at it, wondering how the hell we got to this point. It wasn't a meeting. It was an intervention, an ambush. One of those moments where the people you love sit across from you with forced smiles and say, "We're doing this because we care." But they don't. Not really. What they care about is control and keeping the family image tidy. I wasn't playing my part anymore, and that made them uncomfortable. They said they were worried because I didn't post about work online, because I wasn't showing up to family dinners, because I'd gone quiet. To them, silence equals failure. To them, a woman over 50 without a visible career is just floating, maybe even falling. I sat at the end of the dining table. My father's old laptop was open, screen glowing faint blue. My brother Danny, 10 years younger and never once paid rent in his life, pushed a spreadsheet across the table and said, like a guidance counselor at a failing high school, "I found some listings, Linda. Retail, customer service, even a delivery driver gig." I let out a short laugh. No one else did. My mother pursed her lips and folded her arms. "Linda, you can't keep drifting like this. You're not getting any younger." My dad stayed quiet, staring down at his hands like he regretted showing up, but didn't know how to leave. I'm the oldest. I was always the one to watch. Back in the day, Mom used to parade me in front of the neighbors. "This is Linda, editor-in-chief of a national magazine." When I got my first book deal, they threw a little dinner party. That was 12 years ago. Since then, I left the corporate world on my own terms. I got tired of being told what to write and who to please. I started freelancing, quiet work, consulting, building communities online. I wasn't loud about it, but I was steady. I was proud of the life I was building. Small, but mine. I didn't tell them because I knew what they'd say. In my family, if you don't clock in somewhere, it doesn't count. If there's no title on a business card, it must be fake. My sister-in-law, Kelly, once said to me, "I don't know how you live like that. No structure, no benefits, no boss." I smiled and said nothing. I used to live like Kelly, actually. Married at 29, divorced at 34, 2 failed startups and a new candle business every other year. Kelly fails upwards, and the family cheers her on. I say no once to lending her money, and suddenly, I'm the selfish one. It was 3 months ago when Mom called me out of the blue. Her voice dripping with guilt manipulation. "Kelly wants to open a wellness cafe. Can you help her with $5,000 just until things take off?" I told her I couldn't. She paused, then said, "Then don't bother calling me Mom." I stood in my kitchen after the call, surrounded by unwashed dishes, in the low hum of the fridge, feeling more alone than I had in years. It was like she'd reached into my chest and pulled something out, quietly, cleanly. No blood, just absence. That night I didn't sleep. I lay there staring at the ceiling, thinking about every hour I'd put into becoming the woman I was. Each late-night edit, each unpaid trial, each pitch that took days to get right. They didn't know any of it, because they never asked. To them, I didn't matter unless I was a headline. Funny how the universe listens when you stop explaining yourself. 2 weeks later, I got an email from Forbes. They'd been following the community I built, an online hub for midlife creatives with over 300,000 active members. They wanted to feature me, a full spread. I said yes, spoke my truth, softly, clearly. No drama, no tears. Just facts. Facts they couldn't ignore. The article ran online first, then in print. Meet Linda Ray, the woman quietly changing the face of freelance media. My inbox exploded. My client list doubled. I was on panels. I was in talks for a book deal. I didn't tell my family. I left a copy of the magazine on the hallway table when Kelly came over to borrow my juicer. She saw it, didn't say anything, just snapped a photo and, I assume, sent it to everyone. That night, Mom called. For the first time in a long while, her voice didn't carry that sharp edge. "I read it," she said. "I didn't realize you were doing so much." I answered quietly. "You never asked." A few days later, the family asked to meet again. I thought maybe, this would be different. Maybe they'd apologize. Maybe there'd be some recognition, some warmth. But no, Kelly started. "Now that you're, established, maybe you could help me get some sponsors." I didn't speak. Then Dad said, "We're proud of you, honey. But success means giving back, right? To your family?" I smiled. It was the kind of smile that says, "I see you. I really see you now. You held a meeting to help me find a job," I said. "Now you're holding one so I can help you." Interesting how that works. No one spoke after that. Danny looked at his phone. Kelly shifted in her seat. I stood up, left my untouched tea on the table, walked out. The night was cold, sharp, but for the first time in years, I didn't feel small. I didn't go back to their house for a while after that. Didn't answer texts unless they were neutral. Birthdays, forwarded memes, vague family updates. I replied with one-word responses. "Thanks. Okay. Congrats." I wasn't angry, not really. It was something colder than that. Like the frost that forms inside an unused freezer. Quiet. Still, but final. Sometimes silence isn't an absence. It's a choice. I buried myself in work. Not the frantic, look-at-me kind of work they would have understood, but the slow, deliberate building of something that felt like mine. The online community grew. I signed with a literary agent. I was giving talks, quiet ones, for quiet people, about the dignity of invisible labor, about starting over at 50, about redefining worth in a world obsessed with titles and income brackets. People wrote me long, vulnerable messages. I thought I was the only one. Your story made me feel less alone. I used to think I'd missed my chance. Those strangers gave me something my own family never did. Permission to exist as I was. One day, a woman approached me after a small conference in Seattle. She looked about my age, worn but strong. She took my hand and said, "Thank you. I left my marriage last year after 25 years of pretending. I'm starting a vintage clothing shop. I don't know if it'll work, but for the first time, I don't feel ashamed of not knowing." I hugged her, not because it was polite, but because I knew exactly what she meant. Meanwhile, back home, they were still playing the same roles. My mother updated her church friends about Kelly's entrepreneurial journey. My father mowed the lawn and pretended the world hadn't changed around him. Danny got promoted to assistant manager at the car lot and acted like he invented business. They circled around their little dramas, needing me only when there was a bill to pay or a connection to exploit. One afternoon, I got a call from Kelly. I almost didn't pick up, but something in me, some habit, some old scar, still wanted to believe she might say something real. "Hey," she said, voice sweet like syrup. "You know that startup you did a podcast with last month? Think you could get them to sponsor my next project?" There it was again. The entitlement, the assumption that my work was theirs to use, that I was just a bridge to their next handout. I said nothing, just silence. "Linda, you there?" "I'm here," I said finally. But I'm not available. Click. I hung up. It felt good. Not dramatic, just clean. Like opening a window in a stuffy room. But of course, that didn't go over well. A few days later, I got an email from my mother. Long, dramatic, laced with passive aggression. She wrote about how families should help each other, how I was becoming distant, how I'd changed since that article came out. The part that stuck with me was the line, "We just don't understand why you're being so cold." Cold. That word sat on my screen like a verdict. But I didn't feel cold. I felt finished. There's a difference. You can love people and still choose to protect yourself from them. I didn't reply to the email. I didn't explain myself. I just sat there, in my little apartment above a bookstore, sipping coffee that had gone lukewarm, feeling the quiet hum of freedom. I wasn't lonely. I had solitude. That's not the same thing. The weirdest part? I missed them. Not the people they were, but the people I used to pretend they were. The fantasy version of family I held onto for far too long. The one where they clapped when I succeeded. The one where they asked questions and really listened. The one where I wasn't just useful. I was loved. But nostalgia is a liar. It only shows you the highlight reel. Not the silence after your mother hangs up on you. Not the empty chair they never notice you sitting in. Still, I didn't shut the door completely. I didn't block numbers. I didn't post long social media rants. I didn't need to. That's the thing about quiet revenge. It doesn't come with fireworks. It comes with clarity. And slowly, I started building again. A new team. A better structure. I hired 2 women over 50 who'd been laid off during the pandemic. One of them, Sharon, told me during our first Zoom call, I didn't think anyone would take a chance on me again. Not at this age. I said, "You're not a chance. You're an asset." She cried. I waited. Then we got to work, and the business grew. While my family was busy planning side hustles I'd never fund, I was busy building a company that made room for women like me. Not just room. Respect. Voice. Ownership. That was the real win. But the twist, that came later. In a way, I never saw coming. It started with an email. Subject line. Panel invitation. Women in Leadership Summit. I almost deleted it, assuming it was another generic webinar. But something made me open it. A week later, I was on a call with the summit organizer, a sharp, kind woman named Patrice, who told me she'd been following my work for over a year. She wanted me to headline a panel called Redefining Success After 50. The event would be in San Francisco. A big stage, real press, actual cameras, my face on banners. Part of me wanted to say no. I didn't like the spotlight, not in that way. I preferred rooms with dim lights and honest conversations. But another part of me, the part that had stayed quiet at that dining table with my family, said yes. I flew out a month later, alone, checked into a hotel with sheets too white and a view too perfect. I stood by the window that first night, watching the skyline. I thought about how, just a year ago, I was sitting on a mattress in a rented room, wondering if I'd lost everything. Now I was here, listed alongside women who ran empires. On the day of the panel, I wore navy, no flashy jewelry, just a small silver ring I'd bought for myself after that first article came out. It wasn't fancy, but it felt earned. The auditorium was packed, rows of women, some young and hungry, some older and tired, some right in between. I spoke quietly, like I always do. I told them about starting over, about being underestimated, about building without applause. I said, some of us don't get second acts. We have to write them ourselves, in the margins. And sometimes, no one claps. You just keep writing anyway. They listened, Afterward, people lined up to talk. A woman in her 60s, with steel gray hair and soft eyes, hugged me without asking. Another one pressed a note into my hand. It read, "Thank you for reminding me I'm not expired." I stood there a long time after the crowd left, looking at the empty chairs, breathing, feeling. That night, I posted a single photo. Me on stage. Caption, "Took me 53 years to get here. Worth every quiet step." I didn't tag anyone, didn't gloat, but Kelly saw it. I knew, because 2 days later, I got a text from her. Just one line, "Wow, didn't realize you were doing all this." I didn't respond. A week passed. Then Danny called. Said Mom was feeling left out. Said she wanted to reconnect. I almost laughed. Left out? She'd spent the last decade treating me like a malfunction. Now that I was visible, suddenly she wanted back in. Still, something in me softened. Maybe it was old muscle memory. Or maybe I just wanted to see how far I'd come. So, I agreed to visit. It had been almost a year since I stepped foot inside that house. Everything looked smaller. The dining table, where they'd handed me that spreadsheet, now held a jigsaw puzzle. The framed photos on the wall were the same, except one new addition: Kelly and her dog on a beach. Mom greeted me like nothing had ever happened. Dad offered me tea. I sat down, cautious, guarded. Then she said it. "I'm sorry, Linda, for not understanding." I didn't expect that. Not from her. Not ever. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. Just said it straight. Simple. "I thought you were drifting," she continued. "But you weren't. You were building something I couldn't see. I should have trusted you." It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was real, and that made it heavy. I looked at her for a long moment, then said, "It hurt, the way you all talked to me. Like I was broken, like I had nothing to offer." "I know," she whispered. "I know." We sat in silence after that, but it wasn't awkward. It was the kind of silence that feels like a bruise, healing. Later, as I was about to leave, Danny caught me at the door. He didn't say much, just, "Proud of you, sis." He meant it. That was enough. I drove home in the dark, windows down, hair messy, heart a little lighter. Sometimes the apology doesn't fix it, but it lets you set it down. Back at my apartment, I opened my laptop. New emails, a few client requests, one from a small business journal asking for a column, and another from a producer, TV apparently. They wanted to talk about turning my story into a feature. I smiled, closed the screen. For years, they saw me as the one who didn't make it. Now, I was the one writing the map, and I wasn't done yet. It was a Thursday when the producer called. Her voice was fast, upbeat, like she was trying to keep pace with her own ambition. "We think your story has legs," she said. "Midlife reinvention, family pressure, personal triumph. It's everything people need to hear right now." I listened quietly. That's something I'd learned in the last few years. When people talk fast, you talk slow. When they assume you're desperate, you act full. When they think they're discovering you, remind them you've already been living the story they're pitching. I didn't say yes right away. I asked questions. About tone, about control, about who gets to tell what. She was surprised. Maybe she expected me to be flattered, eager. I wasn't. Not anymore. I'd spent too much of my life handing my voice over to people who twisted it into something palatable. This time, I'd keep it real, or not at all. "Can I be clear about something?" I said. "This isn't a story about rags to riches. It's not some feel-good, she finally made it narrative. I didn't make it. I rebuilt, silently, carefully. I found my voice after everyone told me I didn't have one." There was a pause. Then she said, "That's exactly the kind of voice we want. We'll see." I thought. But I agreed to a meeting, one step at a time. The day before that meeting, I stopped by the bookstore downstairs. I needed air, and to remind myself who I was before all this started. There, tucked into the corner by the poetry section, was Sharon, my employee, now close friend, reorganizing a stack of indie journals. She looked up and smiled. "You ready for the Hollywood part of your life?" I laughed. "I'm not even sure I want that part." She nodded. "That's how you know you're ready for it." We sat in the back corner, sipping lukewarm coffee and talking about nothing important. That's the thing about real peace. It doesn't need to be deep all the time. It just needs to be present. She told me her teenage daughter had started writing poetry again. Said she found one of my interviews saved on the kids' Pinterest board, under a folder labeled "Who I Want to Be." I didn't know what to say to that, so I just said, "That means everything," because it did. That night, I prepared for the meeting. I didn't overthink my outfit. Dark jeans, blazer, boots I'd had since the magazine days. I didn't write a script. I just opened my notes and read a few of the old journal entries I used to scribble when no one was watching. I am not a failed version of something else. I am a first draft of what's next. That one stuck with me. The next day, in a glass conference room filled with very polished, very young people, I told my story, slowly, clearly. I didn't try to dazzle them. I just told the truth, about being invisible, about watching younger people pass you by, about waking up one day and realizing no one is coming to rescue you. I told them about the family meeting, the spreadsheet, the offer to be a delivery driver, and the look in my mother's eyes when I said I was fine. Just not in a way they could understand. They listened, really listened. The room was quiet for a long time afterward. Then one of the assistants, couldn't have been older than 25, whispered, "My mom needs to hear this." That's when I knew I was in the right room. They offered me a deal, consulting on the script, creative input. I didn't say yes that day. I told them I'd think about it, not because I was unsure, but because I'd earned the right to take my time. On the way out, I passed a group of interns in the lobby. One of them glanced at me, then back at her phone, and for a moment, I wondered if she thought I was someone. Then I realized I am, just not someone she would recognize, and that's okay. I took the long way home, walked through a neighborhood I used to live in years ago, when money was tighter and the future felt like a locked door, passed by the laundromat, where I once cried in a bathroom stall after losing a client, walked past the old apartment with the drafty windows and the creaky floors, the one I loved, even when it didn't love me back. So much had changed, but the sidewalk still cracked in the same place. The coffee shop still burned the muffins, and I still felt like me. When I got back to my apartment, I opened my inbox. More notes, more messages. One from a woman named Deborah, who wrote, "I turned 59 this year and thought it was too late for everything. Your story reminded me I still have time." I stared at that message for a while, not because it surprised me, but because it didn't. Because I knew what she meant, because I'd lived it too, and because I was still writing my second act, with no one's permission but my own. I didn't tell my family about the show, not because I wanted to keep it a secret, but because I didn't owe them that story anymore. There's a difference between hiding and protecting, and I had learned, the hard way, that some people don't know what to do with your truth unless it benefits them. So I let them find out the same way everyone else did, through whispers, through forwarded links, through the slow, sharp hum of other people's success reaching ears that once dismissed it. It was Kelly, of course, who called first. "Is it true?" she asked, voice all sugar and suspicion. "They're doing a TV thing on you?" I let the silence hang. Then, "Yeah." She laughed, but there was no joy in it. "That's wild. You're really lucky, you know." There it was. Lucky. As if the late nights, the rejection, the invisible labor, the years spent building something no one cared to understand, were just a coincidence. As if I'd tripped into this life by mistake. I didn't argue. People like her don't hear the truth unless it's about them. After a beat, she added, "Maybe you could put in a word for me. I've got some ideas, you know. Health and wellness, lifestyle content. I could totally be on camera." I almost smiled. "This one's not about you, Kelly." And I hung up. That was the moment I realized something had shifted for good. Not just in how they saw me, but in how I saw myself. I no longer needed their understanding, or approval, or even their praise. I wasn't angry. I just didn't care anymore. And that was the most powerful place I'd ever been. Later that week, I got a call from Patrice, the summit organizer who'd invited me to speak. She wanted to talk about a mentorship program, something for midlife women looking to re-enter the workforce or pivot into new creative fields. She asked if I'd help design the pilot. I said yes without hesitation. We started with 10 women, each with stories that would break your heart and rebuild it in the same breath. A former nurse who'd been forced into early retirement, a grandmother who used to paint but hadn't touched a brush in 20 years, a corporate VP who walked away after a cancer scare and now didn't know who she was without her title. I didn't teach them how to start over. I just reminded them that they could. We met every week over Zoom. No pressure, no pitch decks, just space, just truth. Sometimes we cried. Sometimes we laughed so hard it startled us. One woman, Janet, held up her first illustration in decades. Said her hands were shaking the whole time. Said it felt like coming home. These women weren't failures. They were fire that had been forced into smoke for too long. I watched them slowly expand back into themselves. And in that process, I grew too. I remembered what it felt like to be seen with softness. Not as a lesson, not as a warning, just as a person trying, again and again, to be whole. Then came the Forbes follow-up, a deeper feature, a spotlight on the mentorship program, on the women I'd worked with, on the quiet little revolution we were building. They sent a photographer this time, young guy, nervous hands, called me ma'am until I told him to stop. He asked if I could sit by the window, hold a coffee cup, maybe pretend I was journaling. I didn't pretend. I just opened the notebook I'd been carrying for years and let him take whatever he wanted. Later, I read what I'd written. I used to think success was proving everyone wrong. Now I think it's just learning to live without asking for permission. That line stayed with me for days. The article ran the next month. They titled it, "The Rebuilder: How One Woman is Redefining Midlife, One Story at a Time." It wasn't flashy, but it was honest. It was mine. And of course, my family saw it. This time, no one called. But 2 weeks later, I got a card in the mail. From my father. It was handwritten. Short, crooked letters on a plain white card. I was wrong. You always had it in you. I just didn't know how to see it. I held that card for a long time. Not because it fixed anything, but because it proved something. Even people who don't understand you can still learn to respect you. Eventually. I didn't call him back, but I kept the card. Slipped it between the pages of my old notebook, next to the first journal entry I'd written the night of that family meeting. Back when they thought I was lost. Turns out, I wasn't lost. I was just walking a road they couldn't recognize. Until now. There's something strange that happens When people start to view you as successful, they forget the silence. They forget the months you didn't speak because your voice felt like a bruise. They forget the way you disappeared for a while, quietly, without drama, because it hurt too much to keep showing up just to be invisible. Now, they see you on panels, on podcasts, in articles, and suddenly, you're strong, inspiring, resilient. But back then, I was just inconvenient. I remember sitting alone in my car after that first article came out, holding a grocery store coffee in one hand, my phone in the other, scrolling through messages from strangers telling me I gave them hope. I wanted to cry, not out of joy, but out of this deep, aching realization. None of these people had ever called me too sensitive. None of them had ever rolled their eyes when I tried to explain why I left my old job or why I didn't go to family cookouts anymore. They just believed me, and that kind of belief, it changes you. That's what I was thinking about when I got the email from the Journal. They wanted a first-person piece, something raw, something about starting over. Word count, 1-200. Deadline, tight. Tone, honest, not glossy. I sat at my desk that night, lights low, and wrote without stopping. I wrote about my father's silence, about my mother's disappointment, about the way my brother smirked when he told me he found a delivery job I might qualify for. I wrote about how it feels to be a woman over 50 in a world that worships reinvention, but only if it's shiny, only if it comes with a TED Talk and a 6-figure check. I wrote, "We're not failed younger women. We're fully formed. We're just inconvenient to a culture that measures success by speed and sparkle." I submitted the piece. No edits. They ran it as is. The night it went live, my inbox filled again. But this time, it wasn't just readers. It was editors, sponsors, literary agents, former colleagues who'd once shrugged when I said I was freelancing. And, buried between them all, was one name I didn't expect. Trish Delaney. Trish was my former boss, the one who'd told me, straight-faced, that the company was going in a younger direction. The one who'd slid my layoff papers across a glass table and said, "You've had a good run, Linda." In her email, she wrote, "Your piece was powerful. Would love to talk. There may be some consulting opportunities at the firm. We've been working on diversifying leadership voices." I stared at the screen for a full minute. Not because I didn't know how to answer, because I did. I wrote back, "Thanks for the kind words. I'm focused on my own firm now, but wishing you all the best. No bitterness, no victory lap, just the truth." Delivered calmly, coldly, maybe, but sometimes cold is clean. A week later, one of my mentorship women, Janet, the one who painted, called to say she'd sold 3 pieces to a gallery. "I kept hearing your voice in my head," she said. "That line you always say. You don't need to explain your worth to people who benefit from not seeing it." I laughed. I'd forgotten I even said that. But I meant it, because that's what this whole journey had taught me. Not how to be fearless. I still had fear. Not how to be unstoppable. I still had limits. But how to be unshakable, in a quiet, grounded way. The kind of strength that doesn't flinch when someone asks, "So what do you do now?" The kind of strength that smiles and says, "I help women rebuild what they were told to abandon." The kind of strength that lets you walk into a room and know deeply that you belong, whether or not anyone claps. Later that month, I hosted a small dinner. Nothing fancy, just a few friends. Some women from the mentorship circle, Sharon. We made pasta. We passed stories like side dishes. No one tried to impress. No one asked for favors. It was the best night I'd had in years. After everyone left, I sat in the quiet kitchen, the table still messy with crumbs and coffee mugs. I didn't clean up right away. I just sat there, thinking. I thought about the girl I used to be, the one who tiptoed around other people's egos, the one who confused being useful with being loved, the one who waited for her turn to matter. And I thought she would be proud of me now. I got up, washed the mugs, turned out the lights, and went to bed. The show finally aired in the fall. It wasn't a blockbuster, no dramatic music, no viral clips, just a quiet, hour-long special on public television about late bloomers and second chances. My face appeared somewhere around the 20-minute mark, sitting on that old velvet chair in my living room, talking in the same tone I always had, calm, plain, truthful. I said things like, "It's not about proving them wrong. It's about not needing to prove anything at all anymore." I watched it alone the night it aired. No watch party, no social media countdown, just me, a blanket, and a bowl of soup I didn't finish. I didn't cry. I didn't cheer. I just watched myself speak. And, for once, didn't flinch at the sound of my own voice. And then, days later, came the twist. My cousin Rachel sent me a photo via text. No caption, just an image. It was a grainy snapshot of my parents' living room, and on the wall above the mantel, between Kelly's wedding portrait and Danny's framed diploma, was a printed copy of the Forbes article. I stared at it for a long time. They didn't say a word to me, never mentioned it, never acknowledged the shift, but they framed it, hung it up, right there in the center of their house, not because they understood me now, but because someone else did. Because now that my name was in bold letters, they could finally say it without shame. That was the twist. They couldn't recognize me when I was quiet, unsure, small, but now that the world called me worthy, they wanted to claim me. I should have been angry. A few years ago, I would have been. But that night, I just felt tired. Tired in the way a wave feels after it's crashed onto the same shore for too long. So I did something I never thought I would. I printed that photo and taped it inside the back of my journal. Underneath it, I wrote, "They never saw me until someone else did. And that's okay. I don't need them to see me anymore. I see myself." It didn't feel like bitterness. It felt like release. After that, things got quieter again. The buzz faded. The features slowed down. And I was glad. I didn't want to live on a screen. I didn't want to become a symbol. I just wanted to keep going. So I did. I kept mentoring. The circle grew. 15 women, then 22. We started meeting in person every quarter. Coffee shops, small venues, someone's backyard once. We laughed louder each time. We carried each other's disappointments like grocery bags, passing them from hand to hand, saying, "You don't have to hold this alone." And somewhere in that rhythm, I realized this was the life I had always wanted. Not the press, not the panels, but this web of real women, real voices, real strength. One day, during a workshop, a woman named Elise stood up and read a letter she'd written to her younger self. She was shaking. We all were. It said, "You will lose things that feel like air, but you will breathe again, just differently and more freely." The room was silent after that, but not heavy, just full. Later that night, Elise came up to me and said, "I only showed up because of that story you told, the one about your family trying to fix you." I looked at her. "They didn't fix me," she smiled. "Exactly. You fixed yourself." That stayed with me, because for so long, I believed healing meant reconciliation, that one day my family would see me, apologize, understand. But now I knew. Healing just meant I no longer needed any of that. They didn't have to understand me. I did. And every day I chose to keep going, without asking for their permission, was a day I wrote a new chapter, one where I wasn't the quiet disappointment anymore. I was the quiet power they never saw coming. It was a Sunday morning when I ran into Kelly at the farmer's market. I hadn't planned on going. I almost didn't, but I'd woken up early, couldn't sleep, and the idea of fresh bread and strawberries felt like a kindness I could give myself. I wore no makeup, sunglasses, an old denim jacket. I was invisible again, and that felt like safety. I was reaching for a bunch of sunflowers when I heard her voice behind me. Well, just like that, like we'd spoken last week. Like years hadn't passed since the last cold call, where she asked for a referral. She stood there in full athleisure, sunglasses propped on her head like a crown, arms crossed in that way she always did when she wanted control. "You look different," she said, almost like a question. "I am," I replied, voice even. Nothing about me rose to meet her performance. She tilted her head, tried to smile. "I saw the interview. You really took off, huh?" I nodded. For a moment, it felt like we were two women standing at a crossroads, holding everything unsaid between us like glass. And then she said it, soft, offhand, like she was tossing me a compliment. Guess all that struggling finally paid off. I don't know what she expected me to do. Laugh? Thank her? Cry? Instead, I just looked at her and said, it wasn't the struggle that paid off. It was what I built in silence, while everyone assumed I was failing. She didn't answer. Maybe she didn't know how. So I smiled, small, quiet, enough, and walked away, sunflowers in hand. I didn't look back. That afternoon, I wrote about the moment in my journal. Forgiveness doesn't always look like a hug. Sometimes it's just choosing not to bleed when someone offers you a knife. That's what that moment was. A refusal to reopen a wound just because someone missed your healing. From that day forward, I stopped checking the numbers. I stopped tracking clicks, shares, mentions, not because they didn't matter, but because they weren't the thing. They were the noise, not the note. The note was the quiet, the mornings where I woke up without dread, the emails from women I'd never meet saying, "You helped me leave," the evenings spent laughing on my apartment floor with women who once thought their lives were over, the solitude that no longer felt like exile, but like sanctuary. I got a call a month later from a local university. They were launching a continuing education series and wanted someone to design a course on narrative recovery. I asked what that meant. They said, helping people take back the pen in their own lives. I said, that's what I've been doing this whole time. So I built it. A 10-week course. No grades, no PowerPoint, just stories, real ones. We sat in a circle every Wednesday night, and I watched strangers turn into survivors, watched them reclaim things they'd buried years ago. Music, language, choices, rage, softness, all of it. One woman brought in the first painting she'd touched in 30 years. Another shared a poem about losing her daughter and learning how to live again in pieces. They didn't need fixing, they just needed space. At the final session, I handed them each a small, blank notebook. Inside the cover, I'd written the same sentence. Your voice was never gone. It was just waiting for you to hear it. One of the men, Carl, a retired teacher who'd lost everything in a divorce, clutched the notebook to his chest and said, "This is the first time in my life someone handed me something and expected me to fill it with who I am." That night, walking back to my apartment in the cool dark, I thought about legacy. Not the big kind, not plaques or awards or names in lights, but the quiet kind. The kind that lives in folded letters, in borrowed strength, in the sound of someone else saying, if she could, maybe I can too. That's the kind of legacy I wanted. That's the kind I was building. And the best part? No one could take it from me. Not anymore. It was nearing winter when I finally visited my parents again. Not for them, but for me. The air was crisp, the sky sharp and white. I brought a pie from the bakery down the street because I knew my mother still judged store-bought, and I wasn't there to make a scene. I was there to see what didn't hurt anymore. The house looked the same. That tired beige siding. The hedge Dad never really trimmed right. The faint smell of lemon polish and something old, like time had thickened in the corners. My mother opened the door and blinked, as if I were a ghost. She stepped aside without speaking. I walked in and placed the pie on the counter. In the living room, the TV murmured something forgettable. My father sat in his chair, the same spot he always claimed, like a throne. He looked up, and for once, didn't look through me. "Linda," he said. Not, "Hey," not, "You came." Just my name, as if saying it now somehow made up for all the years he hadn't. We sat awkwardly. The conversation was brittle. Updates about neighbors, a cousin's wedding, the weather in Ohio. Nothing personal, nothing real. But for once, I didn't try to make it more than it was. At one point, my mother brought out a folder, yellowing at the edges, and placed it on the coffee table. "I kept these," she said. Inside were clippings, articles, printouts, the Forbes feature, the journal piece, even the mentorship flyer I'd mailed to a friend, somehow passed around and returned to her hands. On the last page, someone had scribbled, "She's really doing it." I looked up at her. Her face was still tight, like someone holding back water, but I noticed her hands. They trembled slightly. "I didn't know," she said, barely above a whisper. "Back then, I just thought you were lost." I nodded. "I was," I said, "but not in the way you thought." She didn't apologize. Not really. But that line, that admission, was enough, because it didn't come wrapped in defense. It just sat there, raw and unfinished. My father cleared his throat. "I told your uncle last week about what you're doing." I waited. He added, "He said he was proud." I didn't laugh, though I wanted to. That was his way. He couldn't say it to me, but he'd repeat it through someone else, like an echo he didn't know how to own. Before I left, I asked to use the bathroom, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to see the mirror, the one I used to stare into as a girl, wondering what kind of woman I'd become. I looked at myself now. Lines around the eyes, hair shot with gray, a calm in my face that I'd earned, not by winning, but by surviving. I washed my hands slowly, let the water run hot, and as I dried them, I noticed something tucked behind the sink. A copy of the first article, folded, water-stained, thumb-worn. They'd read it, more than once. I didn't take it with me. I didn't say anything about it. I just turned off the light and walked out, back into a home that had always mistaken silence for peace. But this time, I left on my terms. I walked to my car and didn't look back, not because I was angry, but because I didn't need to check if they were watching. They'd spent years watching. What they never did was see. And now, it didn't matter, because I was no longer performing. I was living. The mentorship program turned 3 years old this spring. We celebrated with nothing extravagant, just coffee, mismatched chairs, and a room full of women who no longer apologized when they spoke. There were old faces and new ones. One woman brought her teenage daughter. Another brought a manuscript she hadn't let anyone read until now. Someone made banana bread. Someone else cried halfway through telling a story about quitting her job at 54 and finally starting her own baking business. No one told her she was too late. No one laughed at her dream. They just listened, like we always do. I watched it all from the corner of the room, hands wrapped around a warm mug. I didn't feel the need to speak. I'd done enough of that. Sometimes, power is letting others fill the space you once fought to occupy. Sharon stood beside me and nudged my arm. You realize what you've built, right? I looked around the room, at the way everyone leaned toward each other, at the softness that replaced performance, at the pride that didn't need permission. Not really, I said. I just kept going. She smiled. That's the point. That night, I walked home through the quiet, my breath visible in the cold. The city lights blinked, the streets hummed their usual lullaby, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like a chapter waiting to be rewritten. I felt finished in the best way. Not over, but whole. Back in my apartment, I sat at the table with my old journal, the one I carried through the worst of it, the one where I wrote angry, small, hopeful things. I flipped to the very first page and read what I'd scribbled the night they held that family meeting. I think they believe I need saving. I think they don't see what I'm trying to grow. I think they'll forget me unless I become someone worth remembering. I read it again, and then I picked up my pen and wrote, right underneath, they didn't save me. They didn't see me, but I remembered myself, and that was enough. I closed the journal, placed it on the shelf between poetry and memoir, where it belonged, and I sat in the stillness for a long time. I didn't feel victorious. I felt steady, and when the silence settled, soft as breath, I whispered something I hadn't dared to say in years, not out loud, not even in my head. I'm proud of you. No audience, no applause, just me and the woman I'd fought to become. And she, quiet, fierce, free, smiled back. End of story. Thank you for walking through it with me.